Rich men often think the law is just another employee on their payroll. They believe that with enough money, truth becomes flexible, and loyalty is something they can buy. Richard Sterling was one of those men. He walked into the Manhattan Supreme Court, holding his mistress's hand, laughing as if the divorce hearing was nothing more than a formality before his victory party. He thought he had stripped his wife of everything, her dignity, her money, and her future. But Richard forgot one thing. Silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's a trap. He didn't know that the judge was holding one specific file on his bench, a file that wouldn't just end the marriage, but would end Richard's entire life as he knew it. The morning air outside the New York County Supreme Court was biting, typical for a late November day in Manhattan, but the chill did nothing to disperse the swarm of photographers gathering at the bottom of the wide stone steps. They were there for one reason: the divorce of the decade. Richard Sterling, the CEO of Sterling Vanguard Holdings, was not a man who did things quietly. He was a titan of private equity, a man whose net worth hovered around the $4 billion mark, and whose ego was arguably worth double that. For weeks, the tabloids had been feeding on the scraps of his scandalous split from Catherine Sterling, his wife of 20 years. The narrative Richard's PR team had spun was brutal and effective. They painted Catherine as a frigid, out-of-touch socialite who had ridden his coattails, while Richard was the vibrant, misunderstood genius who had finally found true love in the arms of his 24-year-old personal assistant, Tiffany Banks. At 8:45 a.m., a caravan of 3 black Cadillac Escalades pulled up to the curb. The paparazzi erupted. Flashes popped like strobe lights in a nightclub. Security guards, massive men in tight suits, spilled out to clear a path. Then, Richard emerged. He looked every inch the billionaire. He wore a bespoke navy suit from Savile Row, cut to perfection, emphasizing his broad shoulders. His silver hair was slicked back, and a confident, almost predatory grin played on his lips. He didn't look like a man facing a somber legal dissolution. He looked like a man arriving at a gala in his honor. But the real gasp from the crowd came when he turned back to the car and extended a hand. Tiffany Banks stepped out. She was dressed to be seen. Instead of the somber, respectful attire usually worn in family court, Tiffany wore a bright red designer dress that hugged every curve, paired with towering stilettos and oversized sunglasses. It was a declaration of war. By bringing his mistress to court on the first day of the trial, Richard was spitting in the face of decorum. He was sending a message to Catherine. I have already won. I can do whatever I want. Mr. Sterling, is it true Catherine is asking for half? A reporter shouted. Richard paused, tightening his grip on Tiffany's waist. He laughed, a deep, booming sound that carried over the traffic of Center Street. Catherine can ask for the moon, folks, but she signed a prenup, an iron-clad one. She'll be lucky to leave with the clothes on her back. Tiffany giggled, leaning into him and whispering something that made him smirk. They walked up the stairs, ignoring the few boos from the crowd, treating the courthouse steps like a red carpet. 10 minutes later, a solitary town car pulled up. There was no security detail, no entourage. The driver opened the door, and Catherine Sterling stepped out. The contrast was painful. Catherine was 45, though she looked younger, with a timeless, elegant beauty that she rarely flaunted. She wore a simple charcoal grey wool coat buttoned to the neck, her hair pulled back in a severe, neat bun. Her face was pale, devoid of makeup save for a touch of lipstick. She looked tired. The reporters went quiet for a moment. There was something tragic about her solitude. Mrs. Sterling, any comment on Tiffany Banks being here? Someone called out, their voice softer than before. Catherine stopped. She turned her head slowly toward the voice. Her eyes were dry, clear, and unreadable. She didn't speak. She simply adjusted her leather gloves, clutched her small black briefcase a little tighter, and ascended the stairs. She walked with a straight back, her gaze fixed on the heavy brass doors of the courthouse. She looked like a woman marching to her execution, or perhaps a soldier marching into a trench. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was stifling. The hallway leading to courtroom 302 was packed. Richard and Tiffany were already there, holding court with Richard's legal team. His lead attorney, Arthur Calloway, was a legend in New York divorce law, a man known as the Butcher of Broadway for how he carved up opponents. Calloway was laughing at something Richard said, slapping the billionaire on the back. When Catherine turned the corner, the laughter stopped abruptly, but the smirks remained. Richard looked his wife up and down, his eyes cold and mocking. "You look tired, Catherine," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone in the hallway to hear. "Maybe you should have taken the settlement offer last month. A condo in Jersey and $5,000 a month? It was generous." Tiffany covered her mouth to hide a snicker, her eyes darting over Catherine's conservative coat with disdain. Catherine stopped in front of them. She looked at Richard, then shifted her gaze to Tiffany. It was the first time she had looked the mistress in the eye since the affair had been plastered on the front page of the Post 3 months ago. "Hello, Richard," Catherine said. Her voice was steady, lacking any tremor of emotion. "We should go inside. The judge is waiting." "Judge Henderson won't help you, Kathy," Richard sneered, stepping closer, using his height to intimidate her. "I play golf with men who own the club Henderson is trying to get into. This is my city. This is my court. You're just a guest." Catherine didn't flinch. She just blinked once. "We'll see." She walked past them, pushing through the heavy double doors into the courtroom. Richard shook his head, turning to Tiffany. "Pathetic. She still thinks she has a chance." "She's just sad, Richie," Tiffany cooed, brushing a piece of lint off his lapel. "Let's just get this over with so we can go to St. Bart's." "Calloway," Richard barked at his lawyer, "destroy her. I don't want her getting a single dime more than the prenup states. In fact, see if we can get her to pay my legal fees for wasting my time." "Consider it done, Richard," Calloway said, cracking his knuckles. "She has Evelyn Moore representing her. The woman is a mouse. She does estate planning, for God's sake. She's not a litigator. This will be a slaughter." They entered the courtroom, confident that the day would end in total victory. But they failed to notice that when Catherine sat down at the defendant's table, she didn't open a file of papers. She didn't stack legal books. She simply placed a single, thin manila folder on the table in front of her. And she waited. Courtroom 302 was an imposing space, paneled in dark mahogany that had absorbed a century of lies and pleas. The air smelled of old paper and floor wax. The gallery was full, mostly junior associates from rival firms coming to watch Arthur Calloway work, along with a few reporters who had managed to get credentials. "All rise," the bailiff bellowed. Judge Harold P. Henderson entered from his chambers. He was a man in his late 60s with a face like a crumpled map and bushy grey eyebrows that seemed to have a life of their own. He was known for being irritable, strict, and notoriously impatient with theatrics. He took his seat, adjusting his robes, and peered over his spectacles at the 2 tables. "Be seated," Henderson grumbled. He shuffled some papers on his high bench. "Case number 44920, Sterling v. Sterling. We are here for the distribution of assets and finalization of divorce decree." He looked at the plaintiff's table. Richard was leaning back in his chair, arm draped casually over the backrest, looking bored. Tiffany was seated in the front row of the gallery directly behind him, crossing and uncrossing her legs. "Mr. Calloway," Judge Henderson nodded to Richard's lawyer. "You may begin your opening statement." Arthur Calloway stood up, buttoning his jacket. He didn't walk to the podium. He paced the floor, commanding the room. "Your Honor," Calloway began, his voice smooth as silk. "This case is simple, tragically simple. My client, Mr. Richard Sterling, is a self-made man who has built an empire through tireless work and risk. 20 years ago, prior to his marriage to the defendant, both parties signed a prenuptial agreement. That agreement, which we have submitted as Exhibit A, clearly states that in the event of a divorce, Mrs. Sterling acts to waive all rights to the Sterling Vanguard stock, real estate acquired during the marriage, and future earnings." Calloway paused for effect, walking over to Catherine's table and looking down at her. Catherine stared straight ahead, her hands folded in her lap. Her lawyer, Evelyn Moore, a small woman with glasses who looked more like a librarian than a shark, was scribbling furiously on a notepad. "The defendant," Calloway continued, "is now attempting to claim emotional distress and breach of implied contract to circumvent this document. She claims infidelity. While my client admits the marriage had broken down long before he found companionship elsewhere, the prenup does not, I repeat, does not, have a fidelity clause. Infidelity, while unfortunate, is legally irrelevant to the division of assets in this contract." Richard smirked, turning to wink at Tiffany. The message was clear. "I cheated, and it doesn't even matter." "We ask that the court enforce the prenup," Calloway concluded. "We offer Mrs. Sterling the stipulated payout of $2 million, plus the deed to the vacation condo in New Jersey. Anything more is extortion." He sat down, looking satisfied. "Ms. Moore?" The judge turned his gaze to Catherine's side. Evelyn Moore stood up. She didn't pace. She didn't project her voice. She stood behind her table, looking slightly nervous. "Your Honor," Evelyn said, her voice soft, "we are not contesting the validity of the signature on the prenup." Richard chuckled audibly. Calloway leaned over to him. "See? She's folding already." "However," Evelyn continued, her voice gaining a steely edge, "we are contesting the completeness of the financial disclosure provided by Mr. Sterling at the time of the marriage, and more importantly, during the entirety of their union. We believe there has been massive, systemic fraud." "Objection," Calloway shot up. "Speculation. Mr. Sterling's finances are audited by top firms." "Overruled. It's an opening statement, Mr. Calloway. Sit down," Judge Henderson snapped. "Continue, Ms. Moore." "We intend to prove," Evelyn said, looking directly at Richard, "that Mr. Sterling has not just been unfaithful to his wife physically, but he has been unfaithful to the court. He has hidden assets, and he has violated a very specific, very old amendment to the corporate bylaws of his own company, a document he seems to have forgotten." Richard frowned. Bylaws? He knew the bylaws. He wrote them. What was she talking about? Evelyn sat down. The judge looked intrigued. "Very well. Mr. Calloway, call your first witness." Calloway decided to go for the jugular immediately. "I call Richard Sterling to the stand." Richard buttoned his jacket and walked to the witness box. He was sworn in. For the next hour, Calloway lobbed him softball questions. Richard painted a picture of a marriage that had been dead for a decade. He described Catherine as distant, unsupportive, and obsessed with spending his money on frivolous charities while he worked 18-hour days. "And regarding Miss Banks?" Calloway asked. "Tiffany was a breath of fresh air," Richard said, putting on a face of mock sincerity. "She supported me when I was at my lowest. Yes, we fell in love before the divorce papers were signed. I'm human. But I tried to make it work with Catherine for years. She just checked out. Thank you, Mr. Sterling. Calloway sat down. "Ms. Moore, your witness," the judge said. Evelyn Moore stood up. She picked up a piece of paper. "Mr. Sterling," she began, "you claim you are worth $4 billion. Is that correct?" "Give or take," Richard said arrogantly. "And you claim that all your assets are listed in the affidavit you provided to this court?" "Absolutely. So, if we were to find an account, say, in the Cayman Islands, under the name Blue Horizon LLC, that would be a mistake." Richard froze for a fraction of a second. Blue Horizon? How did she know that name? That was the shell company he used to funnel kickbacks from construction deals in the early 2000s. But he had closed it years ago. Surely she couldn't trace it. "I have many business interests, Ms. Moore," Richard said smoothly. "I can't recall every defunct LLC from 20 years ago. But if it has money in it, it's minimal." "Minimal," Evelyn repeated. "And your relationship with Ms. Banks, you say it began—" "When?" "About 6 months ago," Richard lied. Evelyn nodded. She didn't push. She simply said, "No further questions." Richard returned to his seat, confused. Why bring up Blue Horizon and then drop it? Why ask about the timeline and not press? "She's incompetent," he whispered to Calloway. "She's fishing." "I called Tiffany Banks to the stand," Calloway announced. This was the victory lap. They wanted to put Tiffany on the stand, to show the world that Richard had moved on, to humiliate Catherine by forcing her to watch the younger, more vibrant woman speak about her husband. It was a cruel move, and it was exactly what Catherine was waiting for. Tiffany Banks strutted to the witness stand. The click-clack of her heels echoed in the silent courtroom. She took the oath, flipping her long blonde hair over her shoulder, and sat down, crossing her legs high. She offered a dazzling smile to the judge, who remained stone-faced. "Miss Banks," Calloway smiled warmly, "could you describe your relationship with Mr. Sterling?" "Oh, it's wonderful," Tiffany gushed. Her voice was high and breathy. "Richard is the most generous, caring man. He saved me, really. We're soulmates." "And were you aware of his marital status when you began dating?" "Well, yes," she sighed, looking down dramatically. "But he told me it was a marriage in name only. They slept in separate rooms. Catherine, well, she didn't understand him. She didn't appreciate his genius. I do." In the gallery, eyes shifted to Catherine. She sat perfectly still, her face a mask of indifference. "Did Mrs. Sterling ever try to contact you?" Calloway asked. "Once," Tiffany lied, glancing at Richard for approval. "She called me and screamed. She threatened me. Said she would ruin Richard if he left her. She's very unstable." Catherine's lawyer, Evelyn, shot up. Objection, hearsay, and lack of foundation. "Sustained," Judge Henderson grunted. "Stick to the facts, Ms. Banks." "The fact is," Tiffany continued, unfazed, "Richard deserves to be happy. Catherine just wants his money. She doesn't love him. I do." Calloway nodded. "Thank you, Miss Banks. No further questions." Evelyn Moore stood up slowly. She adjusted her glasses. She walked around the table and stood directly in front of the witness box. She looked at Tiffany with a mixture of pity and sharpness. "Miss Banks," Evelyn said, "you say you love Mr. Sterling for who he is, not his money. Is that correct?" "Of course," Tiffany snapped. "So the Bentley convertible he bought you last month, that has nothing to do with your affection? It was a gift. And the apartment on Park Avenue, the one he put in your name 3 weeks ago?" Tiffany's eyes widened. "That's private." "It's public record now," Evelyn said calmly. "Ms. Banks, are you aware that Mr. Sterling used funds from the Sterling Family Trust to purchase that apartment? A trust that is technically co-owned by Catherine Sterling." Richard sat up straight. His face went red. He hadn't told Calloway about the source of the funds for the apartment. He had just dipped into the family trust, thinking Catherine would never audit it. "I don't know about his accounts," Tiffany stammered. "Let's talk about timelines," Evelyn said, picking up a document from her table. "You stated you started dating 6 months ago. Yet here I have a receipt for a hotel stay at the Four Seasons in Paris from 2 years ago. The room was booked under Richard Sterling, and room service for 2 was ordered. Champagne and strawberries, and a spa treatment for a Ms. Tiffany Banks." The courtroom gasped. 2 years? That blew the marriage was already dead timeline out of the water. Tiffany looked at Richard. He was glaring at her, silently commanding her to shut up. "And," Evelyn continued, her voice hardening, "are you aware that during that trip to Paris, while you were enjoying the spa, Mrs. Sterling was undergoing chemotherapy for stage 2 breast cancer?" The silence in the room was absolute. It was heavy, suffocating. Even the reporters stopped typing. Richard looked down at the table. He hadn't mentioned the cancer to the press. It didn't fit the vigorous genius narrative to admit he abandoned a sick wife. "I didn't know that," Tiffany whispered, her bravado cracking. "You didn't know," Evelyn pressed, "or you didn't care." "Objection! Argumentative!" Calloway shouted. "Withdrawn," Evelyn said. She turned back to her table. "One last question, Ms. Banks. Did Mr. Sterling ever promise you that he would destroy Catherine in court?" "Yes," Tiffany blurted out, before she could stop herself. "He said he'd leave her with nothing because she was too old to fight back." "Thank you," Evelyn said. "No further questions." Tiffany scrambled off the stand, rushing back to her seat behind Richard. She looked shaken. Richard refused to look at her. He was staring at Catherine. Catherine was finally looking at him. A small, sad smile played on her lips. It wasn't a smile of victory. It was a smile of pity. Judge Henderson cleared his throat. He looked at Richard with distinct distaste. "Mr. Calloway, do you have any other witnesses?" "No, Your Honor," Calloway said, looking flushed. He knew the optical damage was done, but legally he felt he was still safe. The prenup was the shield. Infidelity and cruelty looked bad, but in New York they rarely overturned a prenup. The plaintiff rests. "Defense?" the judge asked. Evelyn Moore stood up. "Your Honor, the defense calls no witnesses." Calloway blinked. No witnesses? No character witnesses to cry about the cancer? No doctors? Was she giving up? "However," Evelyn continued, "we have one piece of evidence we would like to submit. It is a document that came into our possession only yesterday. We ask the court's indulgence to present it." "Object," Calloway started. "If it's relevant, I'll allow it," Henderson cut him off. "What is it, Ms. Moore?" Evelyn picked up the thin manila folder that had been sitting on Catherine's table since the beginning, the one Catherine had guarded like a holy relic. "This," Evelyn said, holding it up, "is the original partnership agreement for Sterling Vanguard, dating back 25 years. Before the prenup, before the billions." Richard rolled his eyes. "That's ancient history. It's superseded by the incorporation papers." "Is it?" Evelyn asked. She walked up to the bench and handed the file to the judge. "I draw your attention to page 14, clause 7, paragraph B. It is known as the Morality and Founder's Integrity Clause." Richard froze. His blood ran cold. He remembered that clause. His father had insisted on it when they started the company. It was a stupid, archaic rule meant to keep the family name clean. He had completely forgotten it existed because nobody ever enforced it. Judge Henderson opened the file. He adjusted his glasses. He read in silence for a long minute. The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the HVAC system. As the judge read, his eyebrows shot up. He looked from the paper to Richard, then back to the paper. Then a look of profound shock crossed his face. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Henderson said, his voice dangerously low. "Are you aware of the contents of this document?" "I vaguely recall it," Richard stammered. "But it's irrelevant. I own 51% of the voting shares. I am the company." "Not according to this," the judge said. He looked at Calloway. "Mr. Calloway, did you review the foundational documents of your client's company?" We focused on the marital assets, Your Honor," Calloway said, sensing a disaster approaching. "Well," Judge Henderson said, closing the file but keeping his hand on it, "it seems you missed something vital. Something that changes the nature of every single asset in this marriage." The judge looked at Catherine. She offered a slight nod. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said, leaning forward. "This file doesn't just discuss morality. It dictates ownership. And if what I am reading is correct, you don't actually own Sterling Vanguard anymore. You haven't owned it since the moment you stepped out of that car with your mistress this morning." The silence in courtroom 302 stretched until it became physically uncomfortable. A stenographer's finger hovered, trembling over a key. Even the air conditioning seemed to hold its breath. Richard Sterling stared at the judge, his face a mask of disbelief that was slowly cracking into terror. "That's impossible," he croaked. "Let me see that." He started to rise, but a sharp look from the bailiff sat him back down. Judge Henderson adjusted his reading glasses, peering over them at Richard with a look of profound disappointment. "Mr. Sterling, you are a man who prides himself on reading the fine print when it comes to acquiring others. It seems you failed to read the fine print of your own existence." The judge placed a hand flat on the open file. "This document is the original deed of partnership between yourself and your late father, Joseph Sterling, dated 25 years ago. Before Sterling Vanguard went public, before you became a fixture in the tabloids." "It's obsolete," Richard argued, his voice rising in panic. "When we incorporated, all prior agreements were nullified." "Not this one," Evelyn Moore interrupted softly from her table. "When the company incorporated, the corporate charter specifically referenced existing foundational bylaws as taking precedence in matters of executive conduct. You signed that charter, Richard. You just never thought it would apply to you." "Enough," Judge Henderson commanded. "I will read the relevant section into the record. Clause 7B, the Founders' Integrity Pact. It states, 'Recognizing that the name Sterling is the company's greatest asset, any sitting CEO bearing that name who engages in public conduct deemed grossly immoral, scandalous, or likely to bring irreparable reputational damage to the firm shall immediately forfeit their voting proxy.'" Richard let out a bark of incredulous laughter. "Scandalous? I'm getting a divorce. Half the CEOs in the Fortune 500 are divorced. This is ridiculous." "If you will let me finish," the judge snapped. His patience evaporated. "The clause specifies that the determination of scandalous conduct is triggered automatically upon the CEO becoming a named defendant in a legal proceeding involving moral turpitude, wherein said CEO flaunts the behavior publicly." The judge looked over at Tiffany Banks, who was shrinking into her seat, suddenly aware that her bright red dress was no longer a power move, but a target. "Bringing your mistress, wearing attire better suited for a nightclub than a court of law, to the opening day of a trial where your wife, suffering from cancer, is fighting for her future. Mr. Sterling, that is the definition of flaunting it. You turned this courtroom into a circus to humiliate your wife. Instead, you triggered the clause." Arthur Calloway, Richard's shark of a lawyer, looked like he had swallowed a fishing hook. He was furiously flipping through his own copies of corporate documents, realizing he had missed the most important page in the company's history. "And here is the kicker," Judge Henderson continued, his voice grim. "The clause dictates that upon forfeiture, the voting shares do not revert to the board. To prevent a hostile takeover during a crisis, the voting trust automatically transfers to the vested spousal partner until such time as the reputation of the firm is restored." The gravity of those words hit the room like a physical blow. Richard's face went chalk white. He turned slowly to look at Catherine. Catherine had not moved. She sat with her hands clasped over her small black purse. For the first time all morning, she looked directly at Richard. Her eyes were not angry. They were tired and filled with a profound, aching pity. "You mean," Richard whispered, his voice trembling. "I mean, Mr. Sterling," the judge said, closing the file with a loud thud, "that as of 9:00 a.m. this morning, when you walked up those courthouse steps parading your infidelity for the cameras, you stripped yourself of control. Mrs. Catherine Sterling is currently the acting majority shareholder and de facto head of Sterling Vanguard Holdings." The courtroom erupted. The reporters were tripping over each other to get out of the door to file the story. This wasn't just a divorce anymore. This was the biggest corporate coup in a decade, and it happened by accident. "Order! Order!" The judge banged his gavel. "Sit down! Nobody leaves this room!" When the noise subsided, Richard was gripping the table, his knuckles white. "This is a trick. Catherine, you can't do this. You don't know the first thing about running the company." Catherine finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, yet it carried to every corner of the room. "I know that you don't leverage the employee pension fund to cover bad debts in Macau, Richard. I know that you don't cut R&D funding to pay for a Mistress's Park Avenue apartment. I think I know enough to stop the bleeding." Richard looked at her as if he'd never seen her before. The quiet, compliant wife who hosted his dinner parties and looked the other way was gone. In her place was the woman who had quietly kept the books for the first 5 years of their marriage before he got too arrogant to listen to her. "Mr. Calloway," the judge said, addressing Richard's shell-shocked lawyer, "in light of this revelation, your motion to enforce the prenuptial agreement is denied. The prenup was based on the presumption of Mr. Sterling's assets. Those assets are now in profound dispute. We are moving directly to the discovery phase regarding marital fraud." "Your Honor, we need a recess," Calloway begged, wiping sweat from his forehead. "We need to evaluate our position." "You have 1 hour for lunch," Judge Henderson said. "When we return, Ms. Moore is going to walk us through just how much of Mrs. Sterling's money Mr. Sterling has been lighting on fire." As the gavel banged, ending the session, Richard slumped into his chair. He felt a hand on his arm. It was Tiffany. "Richard," she whispered urgently, "what does this mean? Do you still have the jet? We're supposed to be in Aspen next week." Richard jerked his arm away, looking at her with sudden repulsion. "Are you insane? Didn't you hear him? I might not even have a job by this afternoon." Tiffany recoiled, her eyes narrowing. The soulmate facade evaporated instantly. "Well, you better fix it. I didn't sign up to date a broke guy." She grabbed her designer purse and stalked out of the courtroom before him, the click-clack of her heels sounding like gunfire. Richard watched her go, alone at his table, realizing that the parade of hubris he had led this morning had just marched him straight off a cliff. The 1-hour recess felt like 5 minutes to Richard, and like a lifetime to Catherine. When court reconvened, the atmosphere had shifted completely. The air of invincibility around the plaintiff's table was gone, replaced by the frantic energy of a sinking ship. Richard had spent the hour on the phone in the hallway, screaming at board members who were suddenly too busy to take his calls. His CFO had simply turned his phone off. The news was out. Sterling Vanguard stock had dropped 12% in 45 minutes. The street knew Richard was out, and they were terrified of the uncertainty. Back in the courtroom, Evelyn Moore looked like a different woman. Her nervousness was gone, replaced by the cold precision of a forensic accountant. She didn't just have a file anymore, she had boxes brought in on a dolly. "Your Honor," Evelyn began, "now that the prenuptial agreement has been set aside, we must look at the totality of the marital assets, and to do that, we must look at the lies." She called her next witness, Mr. Arthur Pendleton, a forensic accountant who looked like he enjoyed spreadsheets more than sunshine. For the next 3 hours, Evelyn and Pendleton performed an autopsy on Richard Sterling's finances. It was brutal, methodical, and undeniable. They pulled up the Blue Horizon LLC account Richard had dismissed earlier. It wasn't empty. It held $50 million. "Mr. Pendleton," Evelyn asked, pointing to a projector screen showing a complex web of transactions, "can you explain to the court the origin of these funds?" "Yes," Pendleton said dryly. "They are consulting fees paid by 3 major construction firms in Southeast Asia. These firms were awarded massive contracts by Sterling Vanguard shortly after these deposits were made." "Kickbacks," Judge Henderson murmured, shaking his head. "Objection," Calloway yelled weakly. "That's speculation." "It's a paper trail, Mr. Calloway," the judge retorted. "Sit down." Richard stared at the floor. Those deals had made him a legend. Everyone did it, he told himself. It was how business was done globally. But looking at it now, projected on a screen in a silent courtroom, it just looked like dirty theft. Evelyn moved on. She exposed the Sterling Family Trust. It was meant to be an endowment for their future grandchildren and charities. "Mr. Pendleton, how much has been withdrawn from the trust in the last 24 months?" "Approximately $18 million. "And where did it go?" Pendleton adjusted his glasses. $3 million for the down payment on the Park Avenue apartment, currently occupied by Ms. Tiffany Banks. $200,000 for a Bentley Continental. $5 million lost in high-risk cryptocurrency gambling. And another $10 million funneled into a media company called Glitterati PR. Evelyn turned to Richard. "Glitterati PR. That's the firm that has been placing hit pieces about Catherine in the tabloids for the last 6 months. You used your wife's own retirement money to pay people to slander her publicly." The groans from the gallery were audible. Even Richard's own junior lawyers looked sickened. It wasn't just infidelity, it was financial incest. It was a level of cruelty that went beyond simple greed. Catherine sat through it all, listening to the accounting of how her life had been monetized and degraded. Every dollar spent on Tiffany, every bribe taken, was a betrayal of the 20 years she had invested in him. She felt a deep, burning anger, but she refused to let it show. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Finally, Evelyn produced one last document. It was a loan application Richard had signed just 3 days ago. "This," Evelyn said, holding it up, "is an application for a $100 million personal line of credit from a shadowy overseas lender, using his Sterling Vanguard stock as collateral." "So?" Richard spoke up, trying to regain some ground. "I need liquidity for the divorce settlement." "Mr. Sterling," Evelyn said, her voice dropping to an icy whisper, "you signed this application today, at 10:30 a.m., during the first recess." The room gasped. "You knew," Evelyn pressed. "You knew the judge was looking at the integrity clause. You knew you were about to lose control of the company, so you tried to secretly leverage stock you no longer legally controlled to get cash and run." "That's bank fraud," Judge Henderson said, his voice echoing like doom. "Mr. Calloway, I hope your malpractice insurance is paid up because your client just admitted to a federal crime on the record." Richard looked around the room wildly. The walls were closing in. He wasn't just looking at being poor. He was looking at an orange jumpsuit. He looked at Calloway for help, but the lawyer was actively scooting his chair away from Richard, distancing himself from the blast radius. "Your Honor," Evelyn said, closing her last binder. "Richard Sterling is not a titan of industry. He is a con artist running a Ponzi scheme built on his wife's credit and his father's legacy. We ask the court to freeze all remaining assets immediately, seize his passport, and grant full, permanent control of the Sterling estate to Catherine to begin the process of restitution." Judge Henderson didn't hesitate. "Granted. Bailiffs, take Mr. Sterling's passport. He is not to leave the jurisdiction of New York." Two large bailiffs moved toward Richard. For the first time in his adult life, Richard Sterling looked small. He surrendered his passport with trembling hands. "Court is adjourned until tomorrow morning for final sentencing and asset division," the judge declared. "And Mr. Sterling, if you so much as buy a cup of coffee without this court's permission, I will have you remanded to Rikers Island." The walk out of the courthouse that afternoon was the longest of Richard Sterling's life. 12 hours earlier, he had bounded up these steps a king, holding court with his beautiful mistress, laughing at the world. Now, he walked down them alone. The press was still there, but the tenor had changed completely. They weren't shouting questions about his brilliant business moves or his hot new romance. They smelled blood. "Richard, is it true you're facing indictment? Did you really steal from your wife's cancer fund? Mr. Sterling, how does it feel to be wiped out?" The flashes were blinding, merciless. He tried to push through, but without his security detail, who had vanished the moment the credit card for their company was declined an hour ago, he was at the mercy of the mob. He scanned the crowd desperately for Tiffany. He needed a friendly face, someone to tell him it was all a mistake. He saw her near the street corner. She was standing by the open door of a yellow taxi, loading 2 large Louis Vuitton suitcases into the trunk. She wasn't wearing the red dress anymore. She was in jeans and a hoodie, sunglasses covering her face. "Tiffany!" Richard yelled, pushing a cameraman aside. He ran toward her. "Tiffany, wait!" She turned as he approached, her expression hard. "Where are you going?" he asked, breathless. "Aspen," she said coldly. "With friends, people who can actually afford the trip. But I need you. We need to figure this out together. You said we were soulmates." Tiffany laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Richard, look at yourself. They seized the Bentley. They locked the apartment. You're toxic. The only thing you have left is jail time. I'm 24. I'm not spending my prime visiting you in conjugal." She slammed the trunk shut. "Don't call me. My lawyer will be in touch about emotional damages for dragging me into this mess." She got into the cab and it sped away, leaving him standing on the curb, the exhaust fumes mixing with the bitter taste of reality in his throat. He turned back toward the courthouse. Catherine was just emerging. She walked down the stairs slowly, flanked by Evelyn Moore. She looked exactly the same as she had in the morning, dignified, calm, solitary. The reporters parted for her, a silent acknowledgement of the shift in power. They didn't shout questions at her. They just took photos. Richard stepped into her path at the bottom of the stairs. Evelyn moved to block him, but Catherine put a hand on her lawyer's arm, signaling it was okay. They stood facing each other on the cold pavement of Center Street, the man who had everything and lost it, and the woman who had nothing and gained it all. "You planned this," Richard hissed, his eyes wild. "You knew about that clause the whole time. You let me walk into that trap." "I didn't plan your affair, Richard," Catherine said softly. "I didn't plan your cruelty. I didn't tell you to bring her here today. You did all of that yourself. You built the trap, I just sprung it." "I'll fight you," he vowed, though the fight was already gone from his voice. "I'll appeal. I'll burn the company to the ground before I let you have it." Catherine shook her head slowly. "The company isn't yours to burn anymore. It belongs to the shareholders you defrauded, the employees whose pensions you gambled with, and the legacy your father tried to protect from you." She adjusted the strap of her handbag. "I don't want your money, Richard. I never did. I just wanted my life back, and today I took it." She sidestepped him and walked toward the waiting town car. The driver held the door open for her. Before she got in, she turned back one last time. "The locks on the penthouse have been changed," she said matter-of-factly. "I had your clothes sent to the downtown athletic club. You're paid up there through the end of the month. After that, you're on your own." She got into the car, and it pulled away into the Manhattan traffic. Richard stood alone on the sidewalk. The photographers had gotten their shots and were packing up. The sun was setting, casting long, cold shadows across the city he used to think he owned. He checked his pockets. He had his phone, which was blowing up with angry messages from creditors and $60 in cash. He realized with a sickening lurch that $60 was his entire net worth. The following morning, the atmosphere in courtroom 302 was no longer charged with the electric buzz of scandal. Instead, it held the heavy, solemn weight of an execution. The gallery was packed shoulder to shoulder, yet the silence was absolute. Everyone knew they were witnessing the final act of a tragedy Richard Sterling had written for himself. Judge Henderson didn't rush. He arranged his papers with agonizing slowness, letting Richard sweat in the defendant's chair. Richard looked like a ghost of the man who had strutted up the courthouse steps 24 hours earlier. His suit was rumpled, his tie slightly askew, and the arrogant glint in his eyes had been replaced by a hollow, frantic staring. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Henderson began, his voice echoing off the mahogany walls, "in my 30 years on the bench, I have presided over thousands of divorces. I have seen bitterness, I have seen greed, and I have seen heartbreak. But I have rarely seen such a thorough, arrogant, and premeditated dismantling of a fiduciary duty as I have seen in this courtroom." The judge leaned forward, locking eyes with the billionaire. "You treated this marriage not as a partnership, but as a shell corporation to be looted. You treated your wife not as a life partner, but as a liability to be managed. And you treated this court as a stage for your vanity." Richard opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to offer one last desperate lie, but his lawyer, Arthur Calloway, kicked him under the table. Calloway knew it was over. He was just trying to avoid being sanctioned himself. "The court finds," Henderson continued, reading from the final decree, "that the prenuptial agreement signed 20 years ago is null and void ab initio due to fraudulent inducement and the deliberate concealment of assets. Consequently, all marital assets are subject to equitable distribution." A collective gasp went through the room. The shield was gone. "Furthermore," the judge's voice hardened, "regarding the Founders' Integrity Pact within the Sterling Vanguard bylaws, the court ratifies the activation of Clause 7B. Effective immediately, the voting trust of the Sterling family, comprising 51% of the company's controlling shares, is transferred to the sole custody of Mrs. Catherine Sterling." Richard slumped forward, his forehead hitting the table with a dull thud. It was the sound of a $4 billion empire collapsing. "As restitution for the embezzlement of the family trust and the fraudulent loans taken against company stock," the judge declared, delivering the final blow, "the court awards Mrs. Sterling 100% of the marital real estate, including the Manhattan penthouse, the Hamptons estate, and the villa in St. Bart's. Mr. Sterling, you are left with your personal savings, which, according to the forensic audit we reviewed yesterday, currently amounts to less than the cost of this trial. You can't do this, Richard finally screamed, standing up, his face purple. I built that company. I am Sterling Vanguard. You were Sterling Vanguard, Judge Henderson corrected him coldly. Now you are a defendant in a pending federal bank fraud case. Bailiffs, please escort Mr. Sterling out. He has a meeting with the district attorney in an hour. The walk of shame. The exit from the courthouse was a nightmare. Richard was not led out the back way. He was forced to walk out the front doors, right into the teeth of the media storm he had invited. But this time, there was no Tiffany hanging on his arm. There were no bodyguards clearing a path. Hundreds of cameras clicked in unison, a wall of blinding white light. Richard, how does it feel to be homeless? Did you really steal from a cancer charity? Mr. Sterling, look this way. Give us a smile. He tried to push through the crowd, shielding his face with his hands, but they swarmed him. He reached the curb and instinctively looked for his black Escalade. It wasn't there. The company had repossessed the fleet an hour ago. He stood on the corner of Center Street, jostled by tourists and paparazzi, frantically waving for a yellow taxi. When one finally pulled over, Richard realized he didn't have his platinum credit card. It had been frozen. He had to dig through his pockets, finding a crumpled $20 bill and some loose change. He climbed into the cab, the flashing lights of the cameras pursuing him through the rear window. As the taxi pulled away, he saw a sleek black town car glide up to the curb. Catherine stepped into it, looking serene, flanked by Evelyn Moore. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. He was already in her rear-view mirror. 6 months later, the morning sun streamed into the corner office on the 40th floor of the Sterling Vanguard Tower, illuminating a space that had been completely transformed. The dark, oppressive mahogany paneling and the hunting trophies Richard had loved were gone. The room was now airy, painted in soft creams and blues, filled with modern art and living plants. It felt less like a fortress and more like a sanctuary. Catherine sat behind the desk, not the massive, intimidating desk Richard had used to dwarf his subordinates, but a round, collaborative work table. She was reviewing the Q3 earnings report with Evelyn, who had officially taken over as general counsel. The stock is up another 4% this morning, Evelyn said, placing a tablet on the table. The market loves the stability. They like that you fired the Bros Club in the C-suite and promoted from within. Morale is at an all-time high. Catherine took a sip of herbal tea, looking at the numbers. It's amazing what happens when you treat employees like people instead of overhead, Evelyn. Who knew? We still have a long way to go to clean up the mess in Asia, Evelyn warned gently. The DOJ settlement regarding the Blue Horizon kickbacks is going to be expensive. Pay it, Catherine said instantly. I don't care about the hit to the bottom line. I want a clean slate. I want this company to be something Joseph Sterling would have been proud of again. She stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the sprawling metropolis of New York. It was the same view Richard had looked at for 20 years, but he had only seen dollar signs. Catherine saw the city. Have you heard anything? Evelyn asked, her voice dropping a decibel. Catherine didn't turn around. From Richard? Yes. The prison called last week, Catherine said, her voice devoid of emotion. He wanted me to pay for a private defense attorney. The public defender isn't up to his standards. He claims the food in the holding center is making him sick. Did you answer? No, Catherine said. I had my assistant forward the number to Tiffany Banks. Evelyn chuckled. And how did that go? Tiffany is in Texas now, Catherine replied, a small, ironic smile touching her lips. She married a 70-year-old oil tycoon 3 weeks ago. Apparently, she didn't want to answer a collect call from a federal detention center. Richard was currently living in a nightmare of his own making. Denied bail due to being a flight risk, he was sitting in a 6x8 cell at the Metropolitan Detention Center, awaiting a trial that everyone knew would end in a conviction. The man who had mocked his wife for being boring and old was now aging rapidly in solitary confinement, his only audience the concrete walls and his own regret. Catherine turned back to the room. She looked at the photo on her desk, not of Richard, but of herself, standing alone on a beach in Maine, looking windblown and happy. It was taken the week after her final chemotherapy treatment 3 years ago. She had survived cancer. She had survived Richard. And now, she was thriving. "We have the board meeting in 10 minutes, Catherine said, buttoning her cream-colored blazer. "The institutional investors want to know our strategy for the next fiscal year." "What are you going to tell them?" Evelyn asked, gathering her files. Catherine picked up a simple blue folder. She walked toward the door, her head held high, her steps echoing with quiet confidence. "I'm going to tell them the truth," Catherine said. "That for the first time in 20 years, Sterling Vanguard isn't lying to the world. We're going to build things, not just buy them." She paused at the door, looking back at the empty office one last time. The ghost of Richard Sterling was gone. The air was clean. "Ready?" Evelyn asked. "Yes," Catherine smiled, opening the door. "I've been ready for a long time." And that, my friends, is the story of how Richard Sterling lost everything he had by trying to grasp for more than he deserved. He walked into that courtroom thinking his money made him a god, only to find out that the law and a smart woman can bring even giants to their knees. It's a brutal reminder that arrogance is the most expensive luxury in the world. Catherine showed us that the best revenge isn't screaming or fighting in the streets. It's living well, succeeding, and letting the person who hurt you watch from the sidelines. What do you think? Did Richard deserve a harsher punishment, or was losing his fortune and freedom enough? And would you have answered that phone call from prison? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this saga of justice served cold, please hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel. I'll see you in the next story.